Hello and welcome to the Think Dad podcast, a podcast all about engaging with young dads. My name's Robert Orton.
And my name is Jordan Richardson, and we both work for North East Young Dads and Lads, working with other young dads and their families.
In this series of podcasts, we'll be interviewing a variety of professionals, asking questions about fatherhood engagement and best practice around working with young dads and their families. Let's get into this episode.
Hi, my name is Vicky Sturrs. I'm Head of Learning and Civic Engagement at Baltic Centre for Contemporary Art in Gateshead.
And hi everyone, I'm Michael Richardson. I'm a Senior Lecturer in Human Geography at Newcastle University. And I'm currently on an Innovation and Knowledge Exchange sabbatical here at Baltic.
Why do you think it is important to support young dads?
So it's important to support young dads, I think, for two reasons. And in my answer, I'd break it down in that I think it's important to support dads in general, and the young dad aspect adds a particular perspective that I think is also important to acknowledge. So supporting young dads is something that I think society needs to do more. I think our institutions need to respond, and I'm sure we'll go on to talk about the ways in which Baltic have done so. And really, I think it's about creating a counter-narrative to the stereotypes that affect young dads in general. So breaking that down to showcase the meaningful role that young men can play in their children's lives, I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I suppose just to add that from a Baltic perspective, young dads are our audience. They're part of our visitors, both as young men themselves, as young people visiting the gallery, engaging in contemporary art, but as dads working with, exploring with, learning with their families as well. And that family audience in particular is really, really important for us. And thinking about how we can make that family experience the most inclusive as possible for as many people as possible, particularly for an audience that does experience stereotype, as Michael mentioned there, is really, really important.
Just to touch on that a bit more, Vicky, actually, we'll move on to question 2 now. What, from your perspective, what does good support look like? Using examples from your work, like within the Baltic.
So I suppose if I can maybe give an example of where we've worked in a very targeted way with young dads and their families. So we have just closed an exhibition that we had on for a year by artist Albert Petroni, and it was called Equal Play. And the show very much brought together 2 strands of Albert's practice, one around men and men's role in childcare, and one around non-gendered and non-hierarchical play. And for Albert, he was really creating an exhibition that was exploring the anti-sexist movements of the 1970s and 80s and bringing archive material together from organisations like Achilles Heel, Pressures Against Sexism, bringing together debate from men who were parents at the time and how society treated them and how they thought about childcare, how they thought about their families. And he really balanced that with the idea of play being for everyone. So childcare being a role that anybody should be taking a key role in, and play being something that non-hierarchically we can engage in at any point. So the idea being that play doesn't have a one structured way of doing it. It can be imaginative, we can explore, we can do loads of different games with open-ended pieces. And that project, as part of that project, we worked with yourselves as North East Young Lads and Dads, and we put in a project where Albert was working with a group of young men and their families, and exploring their attitudes to fatherhood and to childcare and what it is to be a dad in this time, and how we create a toolkit for that. And I think that piece was a really important piece, because what it did is it had all of those ingredients for me that showed good support. It had opportunities to be together, to discuss. It had invitation to come and be in a space that felt open and honest. It had hospitality and created a warm space that gave drinks and and food, which I think is such an important thing when you're coming to somewhere that you might not have been before. And it also included families. So it wasn't just that young man on their own, it was the wider world and support network around them, whether that was the charity and the organisation, whether that was parents, partners or children. And I think bringing those things together and bringing people together in that way is a way to explore good support. And I think taking some of those lessons and thinking about how we can encourage people to act out some of those things. What does that welcome look like? What does that hospitality look like? What does that opportunity to work together and have your voice heard and have something that is focused on you and for you and with you to platform your ideas? That for me is what good support looks like. Myself
and Jordan can agree how inclusive it felt over the weeks when we participated in Albert's project in the exhibition. And sometimes even Jordan can say for himself, you unfortunately weren't able to bring your daughter with you, Jordan, but you still felt that you were part of everyone else's family and group at the time when we were participating. So it definitely felt further inclusive. I can agree to that. That was wonderful.
Yeah, definitely.
So in terms of the same question with you, Michael, in terms of your specific role in your profession, same question. What do you think good support looks like for young dads within your sort of profession?
So, yeah, building on what Vicky had said there, I think absolutely those key points of hospitality and welcome were raised. I'm a human geographer, and what that really means is, so my professional work is to understand the relationship of people in the places, surroundings, and environments in which they live. So if I'm looking in relation to this project, what really drew me to it was firstly an artist who was really open to understanding the experiences of the people and the section of society that he was hoping to reach out to. So that was the first level of openness and transparency in that artistic process, which I think was really great. And that as an artist, he was open to challenge and critique that, sometimes you as young men sort of put towards him in response to activities, which was really exciting, that there was an openness to respond to that challenge. And I think through that process, we really kind of created things together. So my involvement in Equal Play was not so much as a facilitator, because that was more Albert's role, but I was almost a kind of participant observer. I was there as part of the sessions to understand sort of what was working and looking forward almost to kind of model this work as an example of really fantastic artistic practice and community engagement. So if we look at the young dad's relationship with Baltic, this has grown over the past 12 months towards effectively a charity in residence now, where you have young men who have not only been part of an exhibition that was a sort of short-term project that dropped out of the community and then sort of left again. Instead, this project has been completely embedded, and actually there's a real longevity to the work. There's you as young dads actually now members of staff who work in this building, which is just a fantastic thing for me to see as sort of demonstrable evidence of this welcome has actually been made meaningful. So this isn't just paying lip service to like an engagement activity, but this is actually saying, as an institution, Baltic values your contribution. So that's one level. But of course, turning it on to the other way, what has really inspired me in my sort of professional work is looking at the ways in which the young dads involved in the project have really excelled in their creative practice. And I think that goes back to my first answer about changing the counter narrative of young men as active and involved in their children's lives, as sort of unlimited creative potential, fantastic imaginations, fantastic emotional intelligence that we've sort of witnessed through this project. And, I'm talking to two fantastic examples and proponents of this, and you've, I think, benefited from this type of project, but, now you're able to, as members of staff of the North East Young Dads and Lads project, to actually, sort of almost spread that message, and not in a kind of evangelical sense of just sort of pushing this idea, but actually to say, look, here's tangible reasons why this works. And to have young men so active within a space like this is just fantastic to see.
Just to quickly touch on that before we move on to the next question, even now that the exhibition's no longer there, we've got all of the zine works and also the participation of the children who helped create those. They're still within our sort of practice in terms of when we've been meeting other services, we've brought that up into discussion, and they've been very interested in keen on having copies of those to then take with them and spread out and just talk about it even further. So even though it's no longer an active thing, it's still ongoing, which it's actually really, it's amazing, to be honest.
And I think that's the joy of a publication as well. Particularly one with an ISBN number, it can be found, it can be searched, it can be available in other ways, and to be able to pass that on to other services and other dads and other organisations and just share that is absolutely brilliant. So that's fab to hear. I'm definitely going to share that with Albert, if that's all right. He'll love it.
So in your work, what challenges do you face with engaging young dads or supporting and including them?
It really is about creating a level of trust and relationship building. And I think that, to me, is sort of the number one aspect that I think needs to be in place to better engage young men in work, whether that be a sort of policy work, whether that be a very specific project. But I think that level of trust and sort of mutual respect needs to be there. And so it is a challenge, but I also think it's a fantastic opportunity that if there is a sustained period of working together, I think that's what is key. So, as I say, it is both a challenge because I think in our sort of funding environment and the pressures that we all face on our time, whether that be researchers, whether that be different sort of arts organisations or different sort of policy or health and practice settings, time is a precious resource. So I understand that it's not easy just to say, we'll offer a bunch of time and that'll fix everybody's problems. Definitely not. But I think we really do need to defend that these things can take time. And so building that into funding applications or different project ideas, I think that for me is key. And if I relate that back to the very specifics of, equal play, I've seen other types of sessions where maybe you have an engagement workshop where sort of young men might be brought in at the end of a project to say, oh, do you want to evaluate it? And you have a one-off afternoon talking about it. And I think that would be so limited in terms of what that could offer. Whereas what we did through our work was this sort of sustained period over 12 months. And I think that's what has led to the more meaningful outcomes.
Yeah, I would echo all of that. I suppose the notion of contemporary art, so taking that from a kind of a cultural sector venue or contemporary art gallery, the notion of that, it has to feel relevant to people and it has to feel like it's telling a story that is relevant to someone's life. And I think when it doesn't, then it's a swing and a miss. And I think what was really brilliant about Equal Play is that it was talking in a way that maybe as Baltic we hadn't talked before. So there was an opportunity to build a relationship slowly, and to kind of to shape something together. But I think there is something there about ensuring as venues, as organisations that are putting things on that are to welcome the public, that we are making shows that speak to people, that have relevance to people's lives and do have something to say and that people can see themselves within. So I think there's something there in terms of what you're sort of selling and how that can engage and capture people. I would also say there's something there. Certainly learning teams tend to be predominantly female. So there can sometimes be a misunderstanding of that space and that need for that space. And I think there's something here about our funders, our big funders, Arts Council, are pushing towards a lot of early years developed work and work for preschoolers and informal family sessions, so people visiting outside of school. And I think a lot of that space, as we all know, tends to be very female heavy. So I suppose it's how you make that inclusive and welcoming. Is there something specific and targeted? Is there something specific and targeted that works outside? How do you ensure that your facilities are dad inclusive? Is there a changer in the male toilets? All of those different things. How do you make sure that your staff understand that because there is a baby with that dad, he is not inherently more difficult or challenging or risky than baby with mom? So I think there's some elements around changing some attitudes. I think there's elements of the offer that you put out. There's the facilities around that as well. So there's layers of all of this. And I just want to echo exactly what Michael said about relationships and things being slow. And I think that's really important. And I think that's something that funders don't always understand, that even as practitioners, we don't understand. And I think that is really important because that's what builds trust. That's what builds criticality. That's what builds space for these kind of conversations. So as a venue, when you know you haven't got something right, you're able to have a critical friend. And I think that's what, moving forward, supports, includes and engages.
It's funny, actually, Vicky, you might have touched on quite a bit there for the next question too.
Okay.
But I'm still going to ask it.
Yeah.
Michael might have some points as well. But no, this is great. Some very, very thought-provoking, interesting answers. I love it. We'll move straight on to the last question then. So again, for both of you, what are your 3 top tips for other organisations who want to better support young dads?
Well, that is an excellent question, and it's it's essentially what I'm spending an entire sabbatical trying to better understand. So I hope I've got some semblance of an answer here, because I think it is really crucial. And ultimately, what would be great is if you're working these, sort of this research project that you're undertaking sort of will be picked up on by different venues and different sectors who really kind of learn some lessons here, which is great to hear. So the sort of initial response, I guess, is that there's an academic notion that arts and cultural venues face a particular challenging critique, but I would argue so do universities, so do different health and social settings, and it's a notion of threshold crossing. How do you get people to cross the threshold literally? How do you get people into your building? Now, that's partly an infrastructural response to say you need to make buildings open and welcome. And partly there's a sort of representation politics about that. Does this space look like you are allowed to be there? So, is it overly regulated? Does it look intimidating at the front with sort of security guards or officials? Does it have people dressed in suits and you therefore feel if you haven't got your sort of fancy clothes on, you're not allowed to be in that space? So those sorts of ideas, I think, are really important. So buildings need to really reflect on and address their threshold. Now, in tackling that, they can't just ask themselves about that because they've designed it. So you need to ask other people. You need to ask your users. And again, it's not okay just to put that message out to people who are already on your mailing list or already friends of your venue, because guess what? They're already friends of your venue. So they already feel welcome there. They don't need to sort of anticipate a problem across the threshold. So really, it has to be more meaningful outreach to say, can we target groups who don't currently use this space? So that's there's a demographic set of work that buildings and institutions and organizations need to do to address that. So that's both outwardly looking and also internally focused in terms of that sort of representation politics. Do the staff in the building, does the building itself sort of meet the needs of the people that would like it to meet? So that's kind of the first thing, which is a big thing. But I think, so if you tackle that, that will go a long way to solving problems. The second point is time, which we've already talked about. I think you need to invest in time to understand that these things take time, but also to really value that, not to get frustrated with it, not to be chasing the next project immediately. And of course, that is difficult for any organization in this current climate of lack of resources and funding. So working through that. So I think we all need to collectively push back to funders to better understand the need for that, would be the second thing. So can we coordinate our efforts to really communicate that message to those people who fund us? And really the third point, which is the end point for me in the journey of this work, is to move from the threshold crossing I've talked about to what actually Baltic talk about, is this radical hospitality. Now, how radical this is in terms of the offer, that's entirely dependent and context specific. Given, if you're a very plush organization with lots of money, I would argue it's not very difficult for you to be very welcoming, because you should be doing these things. If you're an organization facing lots of pressures, whether that be funding pressures, staff pressures, time pressures, then of course it's a more radical decision for you to say, take a hit financially to offer free teas and coffee, or to offer your venue spaces free of charge, etc. So the radical aspect is entirely dependent on who it is who's offering the hospitality. But so that's both kind of in the moment, but I think what also needs to be there, and this is again why this project is so successful, I would argue, with the young dads in Baltic, is that this has gone way beyond the scope of the project, and actually being flexible as an organization or as a venue to the fact that ideas grow legs and sometimes become different things. And I think allowing that to happen is really exciting. So yes, I hope that goes some way to answering your question, Robert.
I feel like I'm probably going to repeat a lot of that. But I think my sort of 3 top tips would be to listen. So when we're working in a realm of something that we aren't experts in, we're only ever experts in our own lives, then seek out that expert and listen. And I think that's really, really important. And I think seeking out non-visiting audiences in exactly the same way, because if you don't, it just rumbles on the same and nothing changes. And it's really important that our organisations, our venues, our institutions are civic spaces for everyone and not for a certain demographic of the world, because that isn't how it should be. And if it's ever going to change properly in the future, it needs to be more open. So I think that seeking out and listening is really important. I think absolutely exactly what Micah said, giving time and space for something to be iterative, for it to develop and grow and change and learn from the week before and grow its legs in all of those different directions, I think is really important, to be able to respond and to be able to change if needed. So I would say that is number 2. And I think the second thing, working in this way, what's really interesting with that project in particular and with working with yourselves, I was really conscious that the project and the people that were taking part and Albert and the show and what we were creating together was really visible, and that people knew about it and they knew who you were, and that we met in a public space and we did our work, and that we were going into the exhibition, and that was regular, so that everybody knew something was happening, and staff were able to talk about it and mention it to visitors, and they were able to recognise people when they came in, and that they were able to say hello and speak differently. And I think that communication across all organisations is really important, because I think that's what changes something from being this thing that sits over here and it isn't really talked about elsewhere, to something that can make change within an organisation and create that really engaging and inclusive space. So yeah, making something really visible would probably be my 3rd top tip.
Yeah, no, I agree on all of those, especially the visible part, because there was many opportunities where when the exhibition was up and we went, we spoke with some visitors, and pretty much all of them said that they were regularly coming down because their kids absolutely loved even though it was a very open and the very simplistic sort of style place, these kids just came up with so many different ideas to get involved with it, whether that's hide and seek, Michael, with Rose, or just building blocks or balancing on the beams and things like that. There was just so many different things that they could get involved with. That project was it was amazing. I love that project. But You know what? That's it. That's all four. That's all 4 questions answered. And that was wonderful. Yeah, that was great. I love that.
You have been listening to the Think Dad podcast with Jordan Richardson
and Robert Orton. This podcast has been produced by NHS, Cumbria, Northumberland, Tyne and Wear, the North East Young Dads and Lads and the University of Lincoln. If you'd like to find out more about our work, please visit the North East Young Dads and Lads website at www.neydl.uk or our bespoke e-learning platform at www.digidad.uk. That's www.digidad.uk.
Until next time, thank you for listening.